you may think it's a disease you no longer need to worry about, but last week, a grandmother from South Yorkshire tragically lost her life after she was unknowingly infected with rabies whilst on holiday in Morocco.
Yvonne Ford from Barnsley received just a small scratch from a stray puppy while she was on holiday back in February, but only became ill 2 weeks ago, at which point the infection was too severe to treat.
Now her family are speaking out in the hope of preventing this from happening to others. In a statement, Yvonne's daughter said, "Our family is still processing this unimaginable loss. We never thought something like this could happen to someone we love. Please take animal bites seriously, vaccinate your pets and educate those around you."
Well, look, we're joined by Dr. Zoe to discuss this. It's always extraordinary, this, Zoe, because rabies isn't here in the UK and it always feels so far away. And then you suddenly hear the tragic case of Yvonne. It's really shocking.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us go on holiday to places like Morocco, Tunisia, Turkey, where these are countries that are considered high risk for rabies. And, you know, a case like this, it's a reminder to all of us, isn't it, that rabies hasn't gone away, whilst it has here and in Western Europe. And when we're travelling further afield, we need to take precautions where necessary, and we need to know what to do if we do come into contact with an animal.
So can you just tell us a little bit about what rabies is?
Yeah, so it's a viral infection that infects the central nervous system, so that's the brain and the spinal cord. And it's got a long incubation period. So like we just said, you know, typically from being bitten or scratched or even licked, if you've got a wound, your skin is broken and you're licked, so it travels in the saliva, or even actually licking mucous membranes, so your mouth, your eyes, it can be transmitted from an animal. Typically, it takes 2 to 3 months before symptoms start, but it can take up to a year. And once symptoms start, it really is untreatable. So, you know, it's in 99.9% of cases, once it actually reaches your central nervous system and symptoms start,
It's too late.
It's too late. So it's really important that people are aware that if they're in a country, you know, before you go on holiday, check which countries you're at risk of rabies. For people who are going to be in those countries for a prolonged period of time, if you're going to be working with animals, you know, if you're going to be going running, cycling, where you're at increased risk of coming into contact with an animal, then it is worth considering getting what we call pre-prophylaxis, so getting a series of rabies vaccinations before you go, which you can pay privately for. But the main thing, even if you have had that or if you haven't, if you are scratched by an animal, bitten by an animal in one of these countries, then you must seek immediate attention. Wash it with soap and water straight away, wash the wound and seek immediate attention. Even if you're flying home the next day, you must seek immediate attention in the country where you are and start a course of what we call post-exposure prophylaxis. So that's a series of injections. If you do that treatment, you're almost definitely going to be OK, but you can't wait to see if symptoms develop. You've got to assume the worst and get treated.
And is that even if it's a minor scratch, anything even minor?
Yeah, anything that breaks the skin, which means that saliva can get into the body, then you have to take action. And I think, you know, we can all imagine if it's a little puppy and the animal might not... An animal can be infected with rabies and not showing any signs, or sometimes in the early stages of their infection, they might even be more affectionate. They feel a bit off and, you know, they can be domestic animals, or they can be strays. So I think any animal in any of these countries, even the slightest bit of scratch, if the skin is broken, or if they've licked a mucous membrane, you've just got to take it seriously. And
are there 2 different types of rabies as well?
Yes, there are. So about 80% of cases are what's termed furious rabies. So this is kind of, I think, the stereotypical, what most of us will think of with rabies, where once the infection is set into the nervous system, people can have hallucinations, be very sort of overactive, sort of excitable, and people may have heard of it, they become this fear of water.
Yes, we were talking about it.
Hydrophobia. And that's because, if we think about how this disease transmits through the saliva. So people, you know, it's really, towards the end of the illness, it is a really devastating illness. People can lose the ability to swallow. So that's what, that's what the virus wants, because that means you produce more saliva, and the saliva's not going down, the saliva's coming out. So viruses want to multiply and spread. So that's why, the virus wants that to happen to the body. So therefore, people can become phobic of water and even air, because eventually it affects the respiratory system and the heart. So, gusts of wind or that can be very distressing for people as well. So that's 80% of cases. The other 20% is called paralytic rabies, and that's where this paralysis sets in, usually from the site of the bite, and spreads very slowly, and people eventually just, become paralysed and
then they're
go
both
into a
deadly,
coma and die. They're both deadly.
It's got an extraordinary mortality rate if it's left untreated.
99.9%. So there's these very, very rare cases, usually in clinical studies, where they're trying, people are put into an induced coma and they're injecting things straight into the spinal cord to treat it. But, yeah, once symptoms set in, once it reaches... So the site of the bite, so we was talking about how it can have this prolonged incubation period. What determines that partly is the severity of the bite, the amount of virus, how much virus actually gets in, but also the location of the bite. So if you're bitten on the foot, it's likely to take longer to get to the brain than if you're bitten on the hand, for example. So, yes, it's once it's set in, once it's actually reached the brain, you can no longer treat it, and 99.9% of people will die.
I've got just a vague recollection of a sort of a drama in the 80s, which was about rabies, that you watched on television, and the animals, sort of like you said, they're very docile, but then they get very aggressive as well. And I can't remember what the drama was, or whether it was even a public information advert that was out there, because rabies was still here. Let's talk about the reality here in the UK. The two cases, I think the previous case to Yvonne's was back in 2018.
2018, yeah.
And that was somebody who'd been in...
Somebody who'd been in Morocco. And I think that was a bite. It was a man. And I believe that actually this same animal had bitten him and bitten a child. The child received the post-exposure prophylaxis treatment and the man didn't. And he, again, several months later, came back to the UK, thought he was fine, and several months later developed symptoms.
So it's one of the reasons we have such stringent quarantine rules for animals coming into the UK, isn't it? As frustrating as that might be for pet owners.
Yeah, so we've been rabies-free here in the UK now since 1922. People may be aware of bats carrying a rabies-like virus. I think it's not actually rabies, but it's very similar. So with the exception of some bats, all animals now in the UK, rabies doesn't exist. And, this is, I think the sad thing is, there are about 60,000 deaths globally, predominantly in Asia, Africa. About 50% of cases are children as well.
Right.
But this is 100% preventable disease with vaccinations of both animals and people and post-exposure. If everybody received treatment, then the deaths are preventable. And in order to eliminate rabies in a particular area, if 70% or more of dogs are vaccinated, then that wipes out rabies and prevents people from dying for it. So the World Health Organization have this initiative called 0 by 30, where they're aiming for, in certain rural areas, to have wiped out rabies by 2030. I think they've been set back by the pandemic, but that's what they're aiming for. So it's about vaccination, because it is 100% preventable.
Yeah. So, Dr. Zoe, if we've got viewers sitting at home watching and they know that they're travelling to countries where rabies is prevalent over the summer, what would be your advice, and would you recommend getting vaccinated?
So I think, first of all, there's a website called Travel Health Pro, where you can find out the country that you're going to, whether it's low risk, moderate risk, high risk. If you are going somewhere that's high risk and you're going to be running, cycling, dealing with animals, it's worth getting the vaccination. It's 3 vaccinations that you need several weeks before you travel, so you should start looking into all of this.
Does it make you
about
feel
8
poorly
weeks before you go? No, well, like most vaccinations, you can have a mild symptoms, soreness at the site, a bit of a mild fever. For other people who don't, if you're going to Morocco for a week, like a typical, or Tunisia or Turkey, most people don't actually get vaccinations before they go. But just be aware of animals, stay clear of animals, even if they're pets, just stay clear. And if you have any interaction, a bite, a scratch, or even a lick, just seek advice locally and take the advice that you're given. Don't wait till you come home. I've heard of people thinking, wait till you come home. The sooner the better. But even if you're hearing this and you think, oh, I was bitten a month ago, go and seek help now. It's never too late, but the sooner the better.
Great stuff.
Thank you.
Zoe, thank you.
Thank you for visiting our This Morning YouTube channel. We upload new content every day, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out, and we'll see you in the morning.